Hello, everyone, and welcome. Dan Diker is director of the Project on Counter-Political Warfare, BDS, and Anti-Semitism at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. He is the author of the recently published book, Israelophobia in the West, which Alan Dershowitz called the Bible for Understanding the New Anti-Semitism. He has authored 5 books on the BDS and delegitimization movement. He is also a research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at the IDC Herzliya. Dan is former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress, the largest global political body representing Jewish communities in over 100 countries. He immigrated to Israel 30 years ago, is father to 5 children, and lives in Gush Etzion with his wife, Ophira. Dan, first of all, thanks for coming here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Tamir, and for that very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be with Im Tirtzu.
Of course.
Speaking to you from Jerusalem.
Thank you, and it's great to have you here again. Now, Dan, over the course of the civil unrest in the U.S., Israel has been pulled into the mix for some reason. We've seen pictures of George Floyd on the backdrop of a Palestinian Liberation Organization flag, or graffiti mixing up F Israel and Free Palestine at the same time. How exactly, in your opinion, does all of this tie together?
You know, the most important 3 words that you just spoke in your important question is Israel's been pulled into the George Floyd murder for some reason. And that's a really good question for some reason, because on the face of it, all this makes no sense from an Israeli point of view. I mean, here you have on May 25th, 2020, a Black American who was arrested for allegedly passing a counterfeit check, is then mistreated and ultimately murdered through this knee-to-neck chokehold by a white American police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so it is purely, on the face of it, a domestic case of police brutality, which joins, many other, unfortunately, many other cases of police brutality across the United States, and an ongoing and intensifying a campaign by the NAACP and other anti-racist or sort of pro-Black rights organization to accuse Black Americans of being indiscriminately and increasingly the targets of this police brutality. And then all of a sudden, within days, Israel's name appears in this George Floyd murder case. Originally, the accusation against the Jewish state was based in a petition by a BDS group at the University of California that stated mendaciously, with no basis in fact whatsoever, that the counterterrorism visits that Israel has hosted in the past years and offered this type of counterterrorism and intelligence training to law enforcement agencies across the United States has somehow made Israel complicit in the George Floyd murder. And I know that many of us in Israel were simply scratching our heads, and as were, by the way, the Israeli police. Mickey Rosenfeld, the most senior public diplomacy officer in the Israeli police, is going, what are they talking about? I mean, this is absolutely absurd. And then clearly, in order to refute such a claim, Steve Pomerantz of JINSA, the Jewish Institute of National Security Affairs, publicly identified himself as the go-to person for these counterintelligence briefings that went on in Israel. But the deeper problem here is that in the aftermath of the Floyd murder, there has never been a type of across-the-board Jewish identification with this very, very tragic case of police brutality in Minneapolis. From the Orthodox Union to the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, the Anti-Defamation League, you had unconditional support for the Black Lives Matter protest movement, mostly nonviolent, following George Floyd that was triggered all over the United States, major cities across the United States, in a way that we have not seen since the 1960s, since the student protests and the protests for civil rights in the 1960s that began, under Martin Luther King and his following, and then became far more radical in the mid to late 1960s. Now, what we're seeing today has been we would call it the replacement of the movement in the 1960s for civil rights that was for Black Americans, for today called African Americans, that was led by Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, Ralph Abernathy, these very distinguished group of very patriotic Americans. And that has been transformed into a radical, America-hating a group of radical leaders who use words like white supremacy, imperialism, colonialism, even Nazism and fascism to describe the established order in the United States. That's what they're saying is the problem with George Floyd, not just a case of police brutality. And that's where Israel comes in, because they have all of a sudden you see the same language that this neo-Marxist or Marxist-Leninist discourse. America is imperialist. America is white supremacist. America is fascist. Being applied to Israel as well. So it started vis-a-vis with Israel with the accusation of complicity in the George Floyd murder, because we supposedly employ this neck-to-knee, this knee-to-neck chokehold on Palestinians, and we taught it to the Americans. So on the one hand, we're responsible for violence against American blacks. On the other hand, this is exactly what Israel is accused of doing to Palestinians. And all of a sudden, then you have the same language, Tamir, used against the Jewish state: imperialistic, colonialistic, words like Nazi and genocidal, being used in connection with this George Floyd murder as a trigger for this intensification of seeing America as this sort of illegitimate entity born in sin, the way they're now responding to what they call the white established racist order in America.
It does seem that way. I completely agree. Now, what role does the idea of intersectionality play in all of this, you think? And how is it harmful in general?
So here you've sort of led us into this natural definition called intersectionality, which people, if you had asked on this program, 50 months ago about intersectionality, they would have thought you were talking about, sex education, intersectionality. But intersectionality is a very serious term that many people understand today as being it is essentially the solidarity and unity of all oppressed groups as one. So Israel has become very much on the target list, perhaps number one or number two on the target list of those proponents of intersectionality, which means you can only be a proponent of Black rights in the United States if you are also a proponent of women's rights in the United States, if you are a proponent of LGBTQ rights in the United States. But here's the kicker. You can only be a card-carrying member of those three minority group protest movements if you are also a hater and an opponent of Zionism and of the Jewish state, the Jewish majority state of Israel. So this type of you are either with us or you are against us is a very, I think, dramatic, drastic, and dangerous development for any minority group, because what it leads to, Tamir, is what was known in Chicago in 2018 as the Dyke March, which was a march of lesbian women for women's rights. And what happened was there were some gay women who also happened to be holding Israeli flags, and they were wholly, driven out of the parade. Because of intersectionality, meaning their identity as gay women, proud women, marching for women's rights, became completely undermined and dismantled by the organizers of such a parade because they dared to be Jewish women who supported the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. So that this type of broad populist, all or nothing solidarity is what I described in our first discussion, the first question a couple of minutes ago, and what very much describes and defines the current Weltanschauung, the outlook, the worldview of this, I think, neo-Marxist approach to oppression. Israel is today on the wrong side of this concept of oppression. Israel today, even though we were one of the founders of the whole concept of the International Criminal Court, of the concept of human rights, Jews were always, and Israel, by the way, through Judge Avi Natan, was one of the founders of the concept of human rights and the protection of international human rights. But today, Israel has been recast as the opposite of justice, as the most unjust creation in the modern political world. And I think that it is an extremely dangerous development for Israel. I'm not sure the Israeli public discourse understands how dangerous this is and how much Israel is being targeted from every direction, right-wing anti-Semitism, and now this radical left-wing discourse in which Israel cannot get out of it because it has nothing to do with the territorial conflict between us and our Palestinian neighbors. There is no way of solving this problem territorially, Tamir. This is an issue of being pinned as a white supremacist country, and the only way to correct that problem is by dismantling, destroying, and replacing, as their discourse goes, the white supremacist country with what they call the brown Palestinians. By the way, that's not to mention the fact that Israel is primarily not a white, the majority of Israelis come from Middle Eastern, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Middle Eastern background. So funny enough, we are not a majority, a white majority country, but that's how we have been cast by this radical and dangerous discourse across the ocean.
Right. So I want to take you back to the Jewish community in light of, again, the intersectionality that we see. It seems like, it can never work to be either Israeli or Jewish or Zionist. And we see perhaps a few weeks ago, there was the Seth Rogen incident that, from what I heard, left a very problematic comment about Israel's right to exist. Can you comment about that? Do you feel that's just an effect to what you were explaining? Or is this maybe perhaps the Jewish community, especially the diaspora Jewry, is somehow triggering it by kind of choosing to take sides with that section?
Well, that's a very important question because, in fact, you're so right. The Jewish community in the diaspora, the United States and Europe, by the way, has been pulled in to this, let's call it a black or white choice. You can either make a choice of backing the whole Black Lives Matter political movement, which means by definition, according to their leadership, that Jews are with them, but they have to be against Israel. You cannot be both. And at the same time, besides this very disturbing and radicalized discourse, we've seen trends over recently and further back, going back some years. Let me just remind us when we talk about Seth Rogen about 12 days ago, and I'll get to Seth in a second, but we've seen more recently in terms of creating context to answer this question. We have Peter Beinart, who was considered, the inspiration, the young commentator, very brilliant young man, terribly incorrect and distorted on his understanding of Zionism and his understanding of where Jews, sovereign Jews, stand in Israel. But he wrote, as you probably remember, a very far-reaching 6,800-word treatise called "I No Longer Believe in a Jewish State," sent shockwaves through the progressive community, because the progressive community may be a critical community of Israel, but it is certainly a community that believes in the right and the legitimacy of the Jewish people to national self-determination, meaning they support the existence of the state of Israel. Now, let's get to Seth Rogen. Yeah. Seth Rogen, I love Seth Rogen's comedy, and so does my wife. My wife, Afir, and I, we both watched Seth Rogen. We watched, oh goodness gracious, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, and big, I think it was called The Big and Bad. And there were half a dozen movies that are really funny. Now, Seth Rogen is a funny guy. He is a guy that can't complete a sentence without laughing. If you go on the internet, watch Seth Rogen, he can't finish one sentence without giggling. That's how, his essence is a chuckle. And Tamir, by the way, just between you and me, because no one else is listening to this, right? He said that he smoked weed every single day for the last 20 years, and therefore that his most creative impulses come from smoking weed. So what he said in the context of all of this on a raw comedy podcast with Mark Marome, another Jewish comic, is that he really, not only does he not believe in religion, his dad was a socialist who met his mom on a kibbutz in Israel a number of, 4 or 5 decades ago. And Seth says he doesn't really understand why Israel exists. It doesn't make any sense from a religious point of view. He doesn't believe in religion. He thinks religion's silly. But from a point of view of defense and protection, which was, one of the reasons that modern political Zionism ended up creating the state of Israel in order so that Jews had a place to go so they could live freely and safely, securely as Jews. But he said, no, that doesn't make any sense. You got to spread out the Jews, because then it becomes too easy for the enemy of the Jews, to drop a bomb on one place and kill the majority of Jews. So what I'm trying to say is that Seth Rogen, and I say this sympathetically to Seth, he was just trying to be funny, but in a very serious topic, and maybe in a topic that you can't laugh about, like the Holocaust. You can't really make jokes about the Holocaust. There's nothing funny about it. There's no way of looking at it in a funny way. But he was trying to be funny. He clearly was also trying to promote his latest movie called American Pickle, which is really very Jewish. In fact, he and Mark Marome said on the program, the movie you just made, Seth, may be too Jewish. It's more Jewish than any movie out there since Yentl. And that was done before you were born, Tamir, back in the late 1970s. Right? So that was like Barbara Streisand in Yentl, which you may have heard of or seen.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
Well. Right? So they're saying this may just be too Jewish, which really reflects something about his Jewishness, right? His sense of identity. But he touched a very sensitive chord among pro-Israel Jews in America and among Israeli Jews in Israel. Because he is just another example of Jews, whether it's Beinhart and now him and others who have made comments that have really questioned why should Israel exist. And by the way, triggered very, not funny, but very serious comments by anti-Semites waiting in the wings, like Minister Louis Farrakhan, who calls Jews Satan and the Jewish state satanic, who has accused actually Israel of starting coronavirus in order to solve coronavirus and make profits on the world. Other anti-Semites, by the way, sports heroes, Ice Cube, big rapper. These are people, Tamir, that have tens of millions of followers on social media. So when we dig down deep and say, what was the real problem with Seth Rogen? I don't think the problem was Seth Rogen per se. I think Seth Rogen is, in some cultural or some ethnic way, a deeply identifying Jew that tried to be cute about the Jewish state, and it didn't, and the joke didn't work. And he admitted that, by the way, in a subsequent interview with Alison Kaplan Summer in a Haaretz interview, which I thought was beautifully done. But the problem, Tamir, is what he triggered among anti-Semites that were just waiting for another Jew to make a comment like that, just like Peter Barnard's comment, because they say, you see, Tamir and Im Tirtzu, the Jews are saying that Israel shouldn't exist. So what the hell are you getting on my case for and calling me an anti-Semite? That's the problem that we face today. One of the several problems in bringing in is when Jews become anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. You have plenty of Jewish, you have If Not Now, you have the Jewish Voice for Peace. These are anti-Zionist, Israel-hating organizations that are basically trading in modern collective anti-Semitism. So that's the context of sensitivity into which, or the waters, the stormy waters into which Seth Rogen waded as in WADED, without really understanding, the type of tidal wave that he was beginning to generate with his, attempted, lousy joke, which he admitted on the Haaretz interview.
But how would you say we should respond to such comments? You hear it every day, whether these people are Jewish or not, whether pro-Israeli or not. People happen to make mistakes and don't necessarily, are accountable for what they say. But how should the Jewish community or how should pro-Israel advocates respond to such comments?
Well, I think it's a very sensitive issue. And I think, once again, you raise a very important question. That's not a black and white issue. I do think that Israel has a very important role to play in really trying to coalesce and embrace as much as possible this sort of middle group. You've got your 20% ideological progressives and radicals, and then you have 60% in the middle, and then you have another 20% on the right, on the hard Zionist right. So we're going for this sort of middle audience. I think Israel has a very, very important role to play here in terms of calling out these types of new anti-Semitic statements, because people don't understand that when you hate the Jewish state and when you call for the dismantling of the Jewish state, or when you refer to the Jewish state as some sort of a Nazi, apartheid, genocidal, war criminal, imperialistic, colonialistic entity, you're trading in anti-Semitism. And I think it's not clear to many Israelis that is anti-Semitism, according to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA definition, which was adopted by most major international powers. But I don't think that discourse and those definitions that the IHRH clarifies and emphasizes, I don't think that's filtered into enough of the mainstream discourse here. And I think that's the critical point, because let's be very clear. Who was it that adopted in 1993 and in the 1990s in Oslo the PLO narrative? Who adopted? We adopted the narrative. We started saying that the PLO and the Palestinian people had all the rights on their side, and we had the right to security on our side. And the minute you create, the minute that you create that type of lack of parity, that lack of equality between our rights and the rights of our adversaries, or the minute that Israel fails to call out and expose the political warfare strategy of our adversaries, such as the PLO leadership, and beginning with Arafat and moving to Mahmoud Abbas, you then automatically become advocates for the narrative of your enemy. And in America, Seth Rogen and other Jewish celebrities in the Jewish community are exposed to the messages that they see Israel conveying, right, over the last 25 years. So we have some housekeeping to do here in Israel as to being very clear as to what is new collective anti-Semitism, what is legitimate criticism of Israel, what is this rhetorical warfare, political warfare strategy that our enemies and adversaries in the Palestinian leadership, and all the more so even in Hamas and others, have used, and now this radical discourse in America is using, right, against us. And we have to be very firm and very clear about calling it out. So I think that we in Israel have a super responsibility to be clear about what's happening. What is the nature of these attacks? Are we going to have some sort of unified bottom line position on these anti-Semitic rhetoric? And that important unity of message in Israel will then echo across the seas.
Completely agree. Now, you've been mentioning the PLO, and both the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Palestinian Authority have been ramping up their political warfare against Israel and Jews everywhere, actually, especially nowadays in light of Israel's meaning to apply sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. Can you maybe explain a little more about what's happening right now? And now, after you were mentioning, that we should be more clear, right, about our response to such comments. How should Israel respond specifically towards all these claims in regard to applying sovereignty?
Well, the applying, I would call it applying Israeli civilian law, even more than applying sovereignty, because this particular set of circumstances, which we call the U.S. Vision for Peace or the U.S. Peace Plan, calls for, well, the official plan doesn't call for it, but the side agreements indicate that the United States government, beginning with President Trump, would be amenable to Israel applying civilian law to certain areas, such as the consensus Jordan Valley, which, by the way, as you know, the Jordan Valley was determined to be the most important strategic terrain in Israel by who? By Yigal Allon, who was Yitzhak Rabin's pre-state commander in the Palmach. And following the 1967 war, just a second of history to give our audience the context here. Right after the 67 war, it was Yigal Allon who outlined this plan called Defensible Borders for Israel, in which he said that this strategic plain and what they call the Gav Hahar, the hilltops, that command a presence over the rest of Israel to the west, including Ben Gurion Airport, all of our communities on the Mediterranean coast, those would be either protected or threatened according to who sat on those hilltops. On the one hand, facing Jordan to the east, on the other hand, facing our Mediterranean coastal cities and communities looking to the west. So the Jordan Valley, the Jordan Rift Valley, and what they call the Judean Samarian Hill Ridge has been the most critical territorial issue that Israel needed to keep in its either sovereignty or security control since the very almost destruction of Israel in 1967. So the Trump administration was the first U.S. administration that completely recognized the strategic importance as well as Israel's historical rights over those areas that were reaffirmed last century in 1920 and then in 1922 by the predecessor organization to the United Nations, which was called the League of Nations, right? So they understood Jewish rights to that property. This was not occupation. This was not Palestinian land ever. It was the last time there was a shift in ownership was during the Ottoman Empire that ended after 400 years of unilateral conquering by the Ottomans. So the point being that Israel needed to explain, and I'm not sure that Israel did a good enough job in explaining this, its possible application of civilian law in that area, as well as in other areas where mostly Jews live, would be part of an overall plan that could result in a sovereign Palestinian entity that in 70% of Judea and Samaria, which was the number that Yigal Allon from the Labor Party used from 1967 all the way through the Oslo, that was used through the Oslo period, but then was ultimately destroyed by another concept brought forth by former Prime Minister Barak. But until that time, every Israeli prime minister since 1967 said the Jordan Valley and the Hill Ridge above Judea and Samaria that everyone watching this program has traveled on and knows exactly what we're talking about, above the Alon Road, will always be in Israel's hands, no matter what. So all the Trump administration did was to operationalize that security requirement that every prime minister since 1967 has insisted upon. But here we're accused of being, an imperialist, a colonialist, all those same adjectives come back, genocidal, illegal settlements. It's all absolute nonsense. It's political warfare, and but Tamir, Israelis have got to be clear on what it really is that we're doing. This is not unilateral annexation. It is not. You know what unilateral annexation is? It's what Turkey did in northern Cyprus. That's unilateral annexation. If you go to northern Cyprus today, it's illegally annexed Turkey. That's unilateral annexation. That's against international law. Or really what the Russians did in Crimea. That's unilateral annexation. What we would be doing is what we did in the Golan Heights back in 1981. No one has a problem with that, right? We offered, there's a precedent for offering citizenship or residential rights to the Palestinian Arabs living in those areas. In 1981, it was to the Druze, living on our side of the Golan Heights. So we have precedent for all this stuff, but we have got to be able to explain this in a way that is very reasonable and clear, as it truthfully is. But because of the political fighting and the disagreements, we end up bleeding between ourselves, and then in that blood, is basically become part of the waterfall that travels to Europe and the United States.
I agree. So I'm going to make this a little bit harder for you. You were mentioning it's not about occupied land or anything, and that we need to be much more clear about it. So, there's no space for misunderstanding. Who needs to take responsibility? Who needs to speak these things out internationally?
Well, I think that if you were to ask every member of 120 members of Knesset, what is occupation? You will probably get one or two correct answers, and you'll get 118 either politically distorted or just absolute ignoramus answers. First of all, and this is important to understand occupation, because that was the key myth that was used against us. Occupation is a term of art in international law, and it refers to a situation in which one sovereign country occupies the sovereign country of another state, right? Well, this is clearly not the case in not in the West Bank and not in Gaza, right? This was non-sovereign territory that was illegally conquered by our Jordanian neighbors and then subsequently conceded by our Jordanian neighbors in 1988. So Israel, unless you're going to claim that Israel has absolutely no claims in its own historical homeland in Judea and Samaria, what every Israeli calls Judea and Samaria, then people begin to use this word occupation in order to try to connect us to the Nazi regime that occupied the vast majority of Europe back in the middle of last century. But occupation in Hebrew, as a second point, what does it mean? Kibush. Kibush doesn't mean the same thing that occupation in English means. It means conquering. So yes, we did conquer the territories in 1967, but that the international legal English term occupation means something very different than the word conquering. So we've got to sort of suss this out among ourselves and understand the distinctions, because the international discourse uses this language as weaponry against the very right and ability of Israel to exist and function as a democratic nation state in the international community. And Israel, I believe, as an Israeli for the last 30 years, has been too insensitive about the importance of international rhetoric, rhetorical attacks, discourse attacks, and now we understand it as delegitimization, we understand it as dehumanization, but it requires us to be very clear about what our rights are in this country and how to operationalize those rights and convey them articulately abroad to people in the West and elsewhere around the world, especially to our own Jewish members of the nation, the members of the Jewish community abroad.
Exactly. So one last question. I'd like to take you there, really. Again, this is my personal feeling, but it seems like, just like with the Golan Heights, the answer is probably within us. And when I say within us, I mean, the Jewish people, whether in Israel or in the diaspora. And so if you could, pass on one profound message to the Jewish people anywhere, whether it's in Israel or abroad, What would you say to them to be able to deal with all this incitement and hatred and everything that's going on internationally right now?
Well, the first thing I think we all have to do is to take a very deep breath collectively, and I think we should take a deep breath in Israel. I think that the answer to all this is Israel, Israel, Israel. It means, as my friend Reform Rabbi Amiel Hirsch of the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York said, Israel is the key to understanding the Jewish heart, Jewish history, the Jewish present, and the Jewish future. And therefore, the answer lies in bringing Jews as much as possible, as Taglit has done, as Birthright has done. Come to Israel. Experience the truth for yourself. Experience the complexities of life in Israel on your own. Don't become the victim. Don't become the victim of Palestinian leadership propaganda. All of these so-called human rights organizations, whether it's Al-Auda or the U.S. Committee for Palestinian Rights or American Muslims for Palestine or Students for Justice in Palestine, these are warfare organizations who all share the Hamas Muslim Brotherhood view that the Jews should be, the Jews in the Jewish state should be killed. Just read the Hamas covenant. This is all consistent with the vast majority, if not every one, of these pro-Palestinian so-called groups in the United States. Jews have to come back to the Jewish state and be involved with the Jewish state, explore their Judaism in the Jewish state. And that means you can be a liberal Jew, a progressive Jew, a secular Jew, a religious Jew, but do it in the context of, the nation state of the Jewish people that has been around here for, nearly 3,500 years as a Jewish collective, and then do a reset. Let's do a collective reset on our identity. It would be a very clarifying experience for all of us. We need to be much more deeply involved with the Jewish state, and so that when we go out into the world, in so much of the world today, in a ground up, in other words, in what they call civil society, in the universities, have placed us on a target list. But in order for us to have a collective bulletproof vest, what they call in Hebrew a shachbatz, we've got to understand our history. We've got to understand where we come from, what we're about, why we're such a vibrant democracy. And then we've also got to do a much better job collectively in exposing our adversaries. We've been too involved in trying to love and engage our adversaries, such as the PLO, and we have to be much sharper in exposing them. They do not wish us well. They wish to replace us, not to join us. And we have to reset the way people really understand who our enemies are and who our allies are. And I think that we in Israel have to be number one on the list of people to do self-clarification so that we can help our friends and allies and family across the waters help clarify it for themselves.
On point. I couldn't agree more. Great, Dan. I'd like to thank you so much for giving us of your time and of joining us. I personally enjoyed it. I think it was eye-opening, and I hope we get some, more opportunities to do this again.
I do too. Enjoyed it very much, and I'm delighted that Im Tirtzu is doing these type of video casts and podcasts. It's a very important organization, and I think that Herzl said it best. Im tirtzu zot lo agada. We have to do it, and we have to do it with pride, and we have to do it without excuses. So thank you, Tamir, and I look forward to joining you again if I get invited.
Definitely, will do. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.